Hello, so this is kind of my next project. It's basically making this positioning arm. I could just buy this one, obviously it's on McMaster-Carr, but if you start looking at the prices, you can see that it's not very economical. These arms alone are pretty expensive. So I just took these design, as you can see they have the CAD model of the parts, figured out how to make them and what all the dimensions are, so if I wanted to buy one of these parts it would fit. And also I bought the material off McMaster-Carr, so I don't really feel bad about stealing their design. So yeah, this will be what we're making. I'll probably change up the base a little bit, and the attachment to the camera is a little different. Yeah, so it will be for my camera so I can get a good shot on my lathe. The issue is with a tripod, you can't get any shot of the piece of the lathe being cut because the only position on the lathe that you can see what's going on is where I stand when I'm cutting. And so you can't put a tripod there, obviously. And so I want to make this arm and attach it to the ceiling above my lathe. It's I think a 10-foot ceiling, maybe 8 foot, so it's not too far above the lathe. And then I can move the camera and get it right onto the part next to my head and completely out of my way, and then I can't bump it or knock it over or anything. So hopefully I'll be able to have better shots and see a little bit more. So let's jump into it. So I'm starting with one of the arms with the balls on the end. I'm using a parting tool here to remove a bulk of the material because the ball turning tool I have isn't really stiff enough to remove it all, so this is a lot easier. Here's my ball turning tool. I made this. It was pretty easy to make, as you can see. The main part is just getting the pivots right. So just some brass washers from True Value were enough to get that working. It leaves a pretty good finish. The tool I'm using has a big radius on the front, so I get a good finish even when this setup isn't very stiff, as this tool is. Here it is finished up. I did make two of these, so it will be farther from my ceiling and so I have more articulation. Here I'm starting on the kind of sockets for those balls. So it's out of a 2-inch piece of aluminum. The arms were about 1.25 inch aluminum. Here I'm just drilling out, pre-boring. I'm going to bore it out to about inch, and then I can start making the socket for the actual ball. Here I am drilling the screw holes to hold this together. I'm going to be cutting it in half and then adding the socket to it. These screws will be the ones that lets me do the adjustment, so I can tighten them up, it'll hold stiff, and then I can loosen them, move it around, and then retighten them. This part was probably the hardest part of the entire project. I had to set up this pretty weird fixture so I could get at the front of these sockets, and then I could come in with a form tool and actually cut the concave into it to hold the balls on the arms. As you can see, I just put it on a faceplate and then used the holes I already drilled and put some bolts through there and held it there. This worked pretty well, but it wasn't the stiffest, so I had to run at a really low RPM, and setting it up took a while. As you can see here, I just used the dead center and some scribe lines. So this isn't perfectly accurate, and I came into some issues with it, but it went okay. Here you can see that form tool I made. It's not perfect either, but I eyeballed it, and it's pretty good. Once again, it didn't really matter. As long as it made contact with the ball along a large enough surface, it holds just fine. This is just some grease. I put some blue dye in so I could kind of see where it was impacting. And here you can see it's making contact along the top edge there in a pretty large area, plenty large enough for this situation. I'd show you kind of why I need to make this camera mount. You can see this is one of my camera setups for machining a part for the camera mount. As you can see, I can't use the tailstock. I can only bring the carriage about that far back, which, you know, isn't really that much to get a pair of calipers in here. So, yeah, it's kind of a pain in the ass. And also, if I was running the chuck at any higher speed, the whole thing starts wobbling, and the image gets all messed up. So here I'm removing the material on the side of the socket I just turned so I can get the arm to go over about 10 degrees. I just eyeballed this. It's not really that important if it's too big. I wanted to make sure it didn't get wider than this ball itself, otherwise it wouldn't have held it anymore, but that was pretty easy to keep from happening. Here you can see how it works. Lets me go a little farther in that one direction. Here I'm making the socket that will mount to the ceiling. I'm going to tap the backside and mount it to a piece of flat steel, and then just have one concave in it, while the other ones have had two, so it can connect the two arms together. Here I'm drilling and tapping the holes to mount this to a piece of flat steel that I can screw to my ceiling. This is kind of a good trick, is just to write kind of the dimensions of where your holes are and the numbers that you want to have on your DRO to drill those holes on. Just write it down on your vise right there. Works really well. You can't forget or mess up, especially when I have numbers like 0.54 that aren't really common numbers and aren't really easy to remember. You know what, it's okay. I really only need 2 holes anyway, and I didn't really want to remake that part. So I'm just drilling out 2 holes into the piece of metal. So there's the socket mounted to the piece of sheet metal. Same process to make the socket on this one. I didn't bother adding the kind of cutout to let it go to a more of an angle, because I didn't really feel like I needed it, because this is the top one at the ceiling, so this length of the arm is only really to move it down towards the lathe, so the 10 degrees of movement is more than enough. Here I am mounting it to my ceiling. I first added this big piece of wood on there so I had a stiff material to drill into. You can see it moves pretty well and is pretty stiff on the ceiling there. here I am just adjusting it. This first time took me a little while because I needed to move every arm, kind of spin it so I could get those reliefs in the right spot, figure out how I wanted to do it. It all took a little while, but from now on it should be pretty easy. Here you can see the attachment to the camera, just a piece of angle iron with a screw on one end that I can, just a 1/4-20 screw just to screw into the bottom of the camera. So I think it turned out pretty well. It'll make filming on the lathe a lot easier. Can get a pretty good shot here. You can see it's a better shot, better angle that I couldn't get with the tripod unless I set it on the lathe, which I didn't want to do. So yeah, it's working really well. I hope you enjoyed this. Thanks for watching. Like, comment, subscribe for more, and have a good day.